Welcome to the podcast, Aron.
Hey, Peter, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So let's get started by giving the listeners a little bit of background about yourself. I know you've been doing Kushki for a little while now, but why don't you tell us some of the highlights of your career to date?
Absolutely. I'm 35 years old. I'm a parent of three beautiful girls, and I was raised in Latin America in Quito, Ecuador, and then had the luck to do my studies both in the United States and China. And as I was finishing university in the United States, I accidentally encountered payments, and I started my first company there when I was 20 years old.
Hmm.
That company ended up growing and sold to an acquiring bank in the United States. And when that chapter ended, myself and the founder of that company is also another Ecuadorian living in the United States called Sebastian. We both were very curious about back home, basically,
Mm-hmm.
how the tech scene in general, or how we could innovate in the region, and that's kind of the underpinnings of how Kushki started.
So what was the problem you saw that, back in Latin America? What was the sort of the drive to start Kushki as far as launching? What did you launch with?
Yeah, so before launch, it was probably first, we were first very, very excited about the region as a whole, right? We saw it kind of like the promised land, right? In our lifetime, it's going to be 1 billion plus people. Most of the population, more than half are millennials and younger.
Right.
When a quarter of the population are Gen Zs, right? It's the population that forgot about analog, right? And forgot about all these conceptions of the world of being mobile or analog, or payments or cash or whatnot. It's just people that are early adopters and alpha consumers in anything they do, right? So we actually got there first investing, and as we were going around investing in technology startups, we saw this gigantic hole, right, which was payment infrastructure. For some odd reason, right, in Latin America, it's kind of the last corner on earth where we haven't commoditized this, right?
Right.
Like everywhere else, right? And there were three big problems there. The first one was fragmentation, regardless if it's cards or some sort of account to account based payment, right? It's incredibly fragmented, right? Within the region, within countries sometimes as well, right? The second one is the actual technology. Most of the stuff that carries all of the volume, right, of transactions in Latin America was built by people in languages that don't exist anymore, right? They've either retired or dead, and those languages are not used anymore.
Right.
And, we're just holding on to this like old infrastructure that won't last, right? So here come us, and we're like, we actually know about payments, and we actually know about Latin America. What are the odds? And as we continued, thinking about Kushki, that's how we said, kind of have this big ambition to turn Kushki into one of the pillars required to the new economy, right? So like if Latin America is going to prosper, it's going to need really good infrastructure to move money from one point to the other. And that was the whole premises of Kushki. And it's incredibly broad, to be quite frank, and ambitious, but that's how we started it, more or less. And kind of the idea was we would like to be one of the pillars in which the new economy stands on in Latin America, right? When it comes to being able to accept payments and transact.
Okay, great. So before we get right into Kushki, I want to sort of step back and let's look at the payments landscape over the last 5-6 years since you launched Kushki. There has been a lot of things happen in the payment space in Latin America, and it's a very different space to what it was when you started. But maybe you could talk about, just describe how has it changed overall in Latin America? How's the payment landscapes changed?
Well, probably the thing I like the most is that there's now optimism around the payment evolution in Latin America. When we started, was all monopolies, regulation that didn't exist, and pretty much cash will be king forever and nothing else works, right? And today, even though there's still monopolies and there's still some, regulation that can improve, right? Everybody's an optimist, and the numbers are starting to show, right? Latin America is one of the fastest growing digital payment place in the world. In some countries, right, cash has surpassed, cash usage has dwindled so much that in comparison to places like the United States and some places in Europe, there's less cash usage in some of the countries in Latin America, right? So you can actually start seeing the evolution, right? In terms of the payments landscape to what we do, I do think that there's some things that remain unchanged quite a bit, right? It's still incredibly hard, right, for businesses to navigate payments in Latin America today. I think it's just the beginning. And the reason is the fragmentation continues to be there. There's very few of us who have tried to consolidate the region, right, to kill the fragmentation. And there's very few of us that are truly local in helping the businesses, right, figure all the local nuances required to operate successfully, as well as to have a next generation pipeline, right? Today, most of the commerce goes through monopolies that still exist, right? And those monopolies sit on very bad technology, are incredibly closed minded, right? So there's some things that remain unchanged, right? But probably the biggest thing is evolution's here to stay. There's kind of like a consensus and optimism that this is changing quite fast, and everybody's incredibly excited to do it, right? So that makes me really, really happy. Other than been incredible success launches in things that reduce cash outside of credit cards and wire transfers. We have a lot of real-time payments rails launching and wallets launching in Latin America that are gaining crazy amount of success as well, right? So
yeah, for sure. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But maybe now let's get into Kushki. How do you describe the company? What do you guys offer?
Well, the company is very simple. Like, Kushki was made to be the infrastructure to move money in Latin America. And the whole mission of the company, if you come to any of our offices or see our email signatures, is connecting Latin America through payments. That's essentially what we do, right? And we started bottoms up. So literally we've gone to build our own processor acquirers, our own connections into all the local switches, is figuring out all the local nuances, so creating all the underwriting and compliance. So a vertically integrated player that sits locally in every country where we operate. And as you zoom out, right, kind of kills the whole fragmentation in the region, right? What do we provide for clients? It's usually APIs for them to be able to do either a pay in or a payout, right, to their customers in between businesses. And we do that in many payment methods. In terms of credit cards, even though, they've gotten overshadowed in the news by things like pigs, it is the highest growth region in the world for credit cards by far, right? They're actually probably the biggest contributor today of cash reduction, credit and debit still. And we do real-time payments, and we do other types of APMs as well, right? And we provide that to clients in terms of pay in, and we also do payouts where we allow people to disperse cash in a compliant, legal, and technological way around the region.
Right. Okay. So then, can you tell us who are some of the companies that you're working with that is using Kushki? Maybe give us an example of what they're actually doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we focus on two types of clients, right? The first ones are local large enterprises, right? So we serve local to local payments for kind of the top enterprises regionally or locally in the countries where we work. And the second one is we serve everybody else indirectly, more or less. So one of the big things that we've tried to correct in Latin America, other than there was very little technology in terms of infrastructure for payments, it's also been a very closed environment controlled by monopolies, and we do the opposite. So we have a lot of clients which are other payment players, which are ISOs, ISVs, There's a lot of platforms being built on top of Kushki that attack, SMBs indirectly, that attack cross-border payments, things as such. So those are the two key clients that we have. In terms of integrations, even though we're kind of invisible, if you go to Latin America, or when you went to Latin America and, you were hailing a ride or buying something online, right, or making an appointment at somewhere, most probably you use Kushki in some of these countries already, right? So it's mostly API based in what we do. And in terms of the rest of the indirect market, it's a crazy amount of stories, right? Because we're kind of opening this very close cocoon of distribution that was payment, especially in acquiring in cards, for example. So we have a ridiculous amount of different types of platform using us, from like a cross-border player that reaches kind of Latin America locally, right? And where they're first or last mile, if you will, to a bottling company, right, that is trying to build a lending product for like little merchants in Peru or in Mexico, to inventory systems, to healthcare appointment systems that are building a payment scheme on top of them, right? And we are the underlying acquirer or provider of infrastructure, right? So we are super excited about that second portion of our indirect business, because we're the first ones to open for business, right? And allowing people to literally build an ecosystem, right?
Right. So then let's just dig into it a little bit. There's a small business in Colombia, for example. They've been selling locally for years, and they now have an online store, and they want to sell to Peru or Mexico, for example. How easy is it for them to accept payments from those countries that to their online store in Colombia?
For the majority, it's been really, really hard, right? Because of the fragmentation. We today, unfortunately, we don't do any small business directly, but we do have indirect channels. So, website builders, card makers,
right,
that basically use us. And now, it's like a plug and play, right? As soon as they do that, right, they're local in all of these places. So it literally, it seems like a simple effort, but took years and years of
right. No, I can appreciate it.
Infrastructure and compliance and regulatory stuff at the end as well, right? We are the first in many licenses in several countries in Latin America, basically, to be able to stand alone by ourselves and be able to do this, right? So I think it's just the beginning, though, Peter, right? In terms of regional payments, cross-border payments, as to our scale, it's kind of like Latin America grows, most payment volume is growing between 25 to 30% year over year, right? Non-cash ones, right? So it's already a crazy market that every 3 to 4 years, right, depending on the country, it doubles, right? So it's ridiculous how fast the market is growing. But in there, right, we've counted the billions of dollars, right, that we move yearly, and we're always like a drop in the water still, right? So it's and there's very few Kushkis today in Latin America who are actually companies that are tech forward and are trying to connect the whole ecosystem, right, and make it very, very easy for people to navigate, and very democratic access to the ecosystem, right? Most of them are legacy companies that are monopolies controlled by conglomerates that are in a single country, like and have a lot of limitations technologically as well, right? So yeah.
So what countries are you operating in today?
Yeah, so we've focused primarily in Spanish-speaking Latin America, and some of our largest countries are Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, right? Yeah.
Okay. So then, what I want to just talk about, you mentioned cash, and like I was in Mexico not that long ago, and still seeing people lining up at the ATM on a Friday afternoon, and cash is still everywhere, it feels like, in Mexico. Is this a major challenge? I mean, is this a major impediment to the growth of digital payments?
I actually think it's the opposite, right? It's when you think about land of opportunity or greenfield opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
having a large amount of population using cash for mundane activities, right? So, for paying something in retail or paying their, utility bill or whatnot, it's like a dream come true for entrepreneurs like me, right? Because there's everything wrong with it, and it's uncomfortable, it's unsafe, it's dirty, it's everything, and all around the region it's starting to change quite fast, right? So even though Mexico today is probably the one that needs the most improvement, right, in cash reduction, the amount that cash is being reduced year over year in Mexico is really, really fast. It's actually one of the fastest, right?
Hmm.
And then you have examples, you have examples of things that were crazy fast, where kind of this exponential effect, like in Chile, for example. In Chile, they went into lockdown because of COVID, and after COVID, now the usage both on and offline of cash in big box retailers is less than 6%. So it actually, people use less cash in Chile within, a year of lockdown, right? Than in the US now, right? So they've surpassed the people use less cash in Chile than the US. And then you have phenomenons. Of course, it's not in every fraction of the economy, but it's mostly on P2P stuff. But you have phenomenons like Yape in Peru or Pix in Brazil, which basically have made cash be, completely eliminated from like a whole portion of the economy, right? In terms of usage, right? So a lot of payment flows where cash no longer exists, right? Like in Brazil, it's funny. In Brazil, you can buy a coconut in the beach, and nobody takes cash. Everybody takes Pix. This is something that 5 years ago would have been unheard of, right?
Right, would have been considered impossible, right?
Correct. So I don't see it as an impediment. I actually see it, it is completely correlated to the the electronic or digital payments industry growing 25 to 30% year over year in Latin America.
Right. So then does Pix? I mean, obviously you're not in Brazil, but you mentioned Yape in Peru, which hasn't quite got the traction of Pix, but still has pretty significant traction. Are those things helping as far as once you digitize payments? I imagine for a company like Kushki, then you're open to other digital methods, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So credit and debit card is our core today, right? But the whole infrastructure was created to be able to take any payment method in general. And today, in terms of APMs, be it real-time payments, wallets, and whatnot, we have over 20 in the regionally in the company, and we're always adding more, right? So it's actually part of our mission. The only thing we don't do is cash, basically. So
right.
These things are actually very, very helpful, right? And we actually move a lot of volume outside, with APMs, right? Things such as real-time payments and wallets, right? So and in some countries it's growing quite fast, right? Yeah.
Okay, so then you're originally from Ecuador, and the government of Ecuador has designated Kushki as the first payment aggregator. Maybe explain what that means and what is the significance of that.
Yeah, so we started the business in Ecuador. It was the first country we started operations in Latin America. We're from there, right? And it was one of the countries that is probably the furthest behind in regulation for payments, right? So it's not uncommon in Ecuador to wait months to be able to accept payments on or offline, right? Having to go to different providers locally to be able to have all the payment methods you need, right? Or acceptance methods that you need. So we've been trying to innovate there for a while, and we were able to open and democratize access for the ecosystem to have technology companies, right? So now a technology company, someone that's not a bank, can actually participate in the system. And that's what the payment aggregator means. It's similar to payment facilitator in general, but it was the first win that, again brings the optimism. You know, we've been kind of doing the hard work in each of these countries, building the plumbing and trying to educate and you know, create an evolution on the ecosystem. And what we did in Ecuador was fantastic, right? Because it's not open now. You know, we were the first ones, obviously, but I think there's 20 now, right? You know, within the year that we built this,
Wow.
right? Yeah. So we've started creating the ecosystem, and there's a lot of examples like that, right? Where some of the fintechs get together, and the nice thing in Latin America is that in most part, the regulators are really interested in evolving this. They just, you know, didn't have the knowledge for it, right? So I think it was a match made in heaven, you know, of getting payment experts and technology experts to speak with regulators to make this happen, right?
Right.
And a good example of that's Brazil. Brazil's at the head of the curve of payment innovation in Latin America and democratizing access, right? So give an example in credit cards, Brazil 12 years ago had a duopoly basically in payment acquirers, and today there's more than 50, right? It's a booming sector, right? You know, it's a market that it's gigantic basically, right? Now, and the barriers of entry are very low. In most of Latin America, we're still behind, right? There's, you know, now there's two players in some of these markets, right?
Right.
The ones with the monopoly and us, right? So we're further behind, but I think it's going to move much faster, right? And we're really happy of what we did in Ecuador, and you know, there's a couple more coming, right? That I think we've been working for years, you know, with the regulators to
Right.
trend policy, and yeah, actually, the Central Bank of Brazil has helped quite a bit, right? Because I think they're probably one of the best examples globally, not only of Latin America, of
Yeah.
collaboration and knowledge. Basically, the stuff they're doing is fantastic, right?
No, I mean they're very well respected. In fact, I was at an event at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and they had a guy from the Central Bank of Brazil speaking there. Very well respected internationally these days. So I want to talk about Mexico. Last year, you acquired a payment terminal provider called Bill Pocket. Tell me about what was the thinking there, and what they actually do.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bill Pocket was actually the first payment facilitator or payment aggregator in Mexico. It was about an 11 or 12-year-old company, right? That did in Mexico this fight, right, to be able to have technology companies or startups join the ecosystem about a decade before Kushki did in Ecuador, maybe. And the company started as a small business MPOS player, right, within Mexico, but eventually turned out to become the first company in Mexico to have the underpinnings of an ISO and ISV program, right? So by the time we came across them, right, we were, as I was telling you before, we really tried to endorse this indirect channel for us to be able, now that we're vertically integrated, control the infrastructure, control kind of all the licenses. We've always wanted to open this up so other people could build on top of Kushki, right? And Bill Pocket's team were doing that successfully in Mexico, right? And we're kind of the first player that we had seen in LATAM actually that you know had something similar to an ISO and ISV and VAR ecosystem, and that's the reason we bought them basically, right? And it's been great because the team is super talented, right? And it's helped us basically to not only accelerate their plans, right, but standardize them regionally, right? So we are bringing into Latin America in the months and years to come a lot of programs, right, for companies that before had no access to, you know, no easy access, right, to be able to connect or embed payments into their offering, all the way to actually being able to build payment businesses, right? You know, be it payment distribution or verticalized payments or whatnot on top of us, which was it's still kind of unheard of in Latin America. Like, if you want to build a payments business, you have to know a lot about payments, have a lot of money or a lot of connections, right? And a lot of patience to basically connect into like the legacy grids in different places, right? So we want to make it as easy as possible. If you want to build a payments business on top of Kushki, you should be able to do it in a month, right? In the whole region, right?
Right. Okay. I want to switch gears and talk about a recent report that you released with Statista. It was on the growth of the digital payments ecosystem in Latin America. I know you have the Kushki Talk series that you were kind enough to invite me along to one of those sessions recently. What are some of the takeaways from this particular report that you did with Statista?
Overall, it kind of pinpoints in more detail where the growth and trends are happening in Latin America. And the whole movement around us doing reports with third parties and starting these series like Kushki Talks, which, by the way, thank you so much for being part of the last edition.
My pleasure.
We find that in Latin America, there's very little data and very little content when it comes to fintech and payments, right? As a matter of fact, when you compare some of the reports or data that are created by, very big brands, they contradict themselves, right? Because they use old data sets and I have this huge debate where, all of a sudden, the card brands think the fraud is gigantic in Latin America. And it really isn't, by the way, right? It's kind of funny because they're all using different sets of data and the data is, not very useful, right? So in Latin America, what we're trying to do with Kushki Talks and reports like the one we did with Statista is to be able to educate, right? And to actually be able to sponsor some real data, right? In each of the countries. And specifically when it comes to Statista, we're speaking a lot about the growth in Mexico, right? And the trends that are happening. So I was telling you about, lowering cash usage, among other things, in Mexico. If your listeners want to, pull that report, Statista, if they want to learn more detail than, what you would read about Mexican payments, it's a great way to start there. Yeah.
Right. I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. Okay. So you mentioned fraud. I mean, how big of a problem is fraud in Latin America, and what is Kushki doing to help reduce it?
Yeah. So I have a good anecdote. I met with the president of this large card brand, and he was telling me, yeah, in Latin America, the fraud rates are insane, right? And I was like, no, they're not, right? And he was so shocked that we actually, kind of went deep on it, right? And the issue is twofold, right? The first one's historically, right? The fraud rates in Latin America have been above average places like Europe and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But it's because data is unstandardized, right? And how you send data in the infrastructure, right? In many ways. And the second one is because no one did anything about it, right? So when you have players that are actually managing fraud and standardizing data, right, in terms of messaging and infrastructure, there really isn't that much fraud, right? And we're a proof of that. We in every country we're in, there, I think there's only a single country we're in where we hit 10% of what the Visa MasterCard average of fraud for the country are, right? So we're like 10 times or better less than that in fraud, right?
Right.
And it's not like we're geniuses. We literally have very just like modern technology, and we have local competencies. So things as simple as being able to control error codes and being able to whitelist bins with the issuers locally that had, very old technology to be able to accept payments, right? So we do little things that are very analog, actually, right? To boost acceptance rates and lower fraud. It's just ecosystem building, and then it comes with a little bit of fraud technology at the end, right? We spend a lot of time, right, in terms of compliance and fraud, of making sure that our clients have the best they can get in Latin America. And it's new to the region. So yeah, there is still today, this is what I was telling you, is Latin America is this weird place where it's like year one, and then the rest of the regions has been completely commoditized, right? So things as fraud rates and acceptance rates, we see these gigantic jumps, right? Where, someone will move from the old pipes to our new ones, right? And all of a sudden they have a 50% improvement in something, or a couple
Right.
100% improvement in something, like that still exists in Latin America. That's what I mean, right? Like you could still do that, right?
Right. Yeah, and in countries like the US, it's hard to get double-digit improvements on any new technology these days. Anyway, last question. I'd love to kind of end with you peering into your crystal ball and talking about the future of digital payments in Latin America. I mean, you've talked about some of the the downward trend of cash, but what's the future going to look like? What are you trying to build, and what when you think of that future?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms for us, the role that we have is an infrastructure one, right? And being a provider for large players or other payment businesses to be able to use us, our licenses, our infrastructure, regardless of the payment method, to move money back and forth, right? So we don't see Kushki as an active participant in doing user or small business stuff, right? So I don't see us moving into anything that has to do in terms of attacking users and doing issuing or wallets or things of the sort, right? In terms of the crystal ball and what I think will happen in Latin America, I think the future is bright, right? I think it's a bit messy because everybody's trying stuff and trying to see what sticks on the wall and what gains a lot of traction, right? So Latin America will not be a place where you will have a homogenous payment evolution like you had in China and a couple of other places, right? I think you'll have a little bit, there will be fragmentation, but it all points that cash will exponentially, right, start disappearing from payment flows in this decade, right? It's already happening, right? Some countries faster than others, but the data's there. As of today, what I can tell you is you have these phenomena like Pix and Yape in certain places, but consistently what is delivering, the most cash reduction is actually debit and credit cards. Sorry about that. Debit and credit cards, right? And they come in different forms. And sometimes not plastic anymore, but it's the same pipelines, right?
Right.
Visa Direct or most neobanks and wallet systems that are gaining traction in Latin America are built on credit and debit rails today, the majority of them, right? So I do think that they will continue to be a relevant player in Latin America when it comes to payment methods that are trying to reduce cash usage. And I think real-time payments is I think Latin America is the place for real-time payments, basically, right?
Right.
Yes.
Okay, well, it's a good place to end. Aron, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Best of luck to you, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, see ya.
Bye.